Namaste. I really like Lewis Richmond, the guy who the first reading is from. He's I believe an insight meditation teacher, and he's written a couple of really good books. One is Aging as a Spiritual Practice, and I want to say he wrote one called Sickness or Illness as a Spiritual Practice, but I could be wrong about that. He also wrote one that I haven't read yet called Work as Spiritual Practice. But he had a pretty significant heart attack at a Catholic monastery. And I should explain that. It wasn't because lightning descended from on high or anything. He lives in California. And really in a lot of parts of the world, or this country anyway, if you want to have a retreat of, decent size, and you don't have a retreat center, there are spaces available in Catholic monasteries and other Catholic places, even like the Cousin Center here next door, that are more than happy to rent you the rooms. And so that's why he happened to be in a Catholic retreat center, and he had this major heart attack, and it was quite a long recovery. And he's a friend of Jack Kornfield, who's another Buddhist teacher I really admire, and then the two of them were teaching a retreat after he had recovered back at this Catholic monastery, and Lewis Richmond had another health scare and had to be taken to the hospital, but it turned out to be nothing that was all that. Certainly wasn't a major heart attack. And then sometime after that, he was on the phone to Jack Kornfield saying he was getting ready to take a trip to Rome, and Jack said, "For God's sakes, don't do it. You'll never survive." But he does a really good job, I think, of explaining what it is about our identity that's, first of all, true, that it does change all the time, what it is, or why it is, I should say, that we often get quite threatened and really quite afraid, which leads to us responding in anger when change occurs that threatens our sense of identity. And implied in that is that if we would just accept the truth that not just our identity, but everything changes all the time, we wouldn't have to become afraid and respond angrily and lash out. Now, I will grant you that that's much easier said than done. But I think the place we really see it, and it's really fascinating to me, is at retirement. If you've known somebody who's retired and didn't know who they were anymore, to the point where they became profoundly depressed because all of their identity was wrapped up in whatever it was they did for a living, you've seen this in action. Back in the day when I could golf, I golfed with a guy at Curry Park, which is a pretty long course. And I don't know if I was alone. I mean, I was obviously with him, but I don't know, if you're not a golfer, you don't know. If you show up at a public golf course, they will match you up with people to get as close to a foursome as they can, because it's the most efficient use of the course. They try to send you out in fours. And so this guy, I got matched up with him, and he was 77 years old and had just got recovered from, I think, prostate surgery, if I remember correctly. And I would never have guessed he was 77. I would have put him more around 60. And he golfed 3 times a week with his friends. And said he didn't miss his work life. He really enjoyed, although he had enjoyed his work life, it's not like he hated whatever it was he did, but he had come to this place where he enjoyed being with his friends. He said he had a neighbor across the street who was his same age, and who at retirement had surgically attached himself to his recliner, stared out the front window, never left the house, and he said if you looked at this guy, you'd swear he was 100 years old. He was cranky. He didn't have any friends that he ever met with anymore. He just stared through his window at the world. And I think that's probably the best story I've ever heard of the difference between holding our identity loosely and allowing it to be fluid and changing, and what happens when we just squeeze the life out of it. And so then this week, I chose the 1 Corinthians passage because, although I don't remember what the gospel was, we already dealt with it a couple weeks ago, and I didn't want to do a rerun. But it's this idea of being all things to all people, which I think is probably an accurate but unfortunate translation of what Paul was trying to say. When I was younger, when I was your age, I couldn't wrap my head around that. And it sounded to me like what was happening was a great game of make-believe. And that Paul was succeeding by pretending to be something he wasn't, which when I was younger led me to ask all kinds of questions about authenticity. And so, and I want to say that I think that was a profound misunderstanding of what Paul's saying, based in youth, and maybe based in the fact that English evolves, and maybe what Paul was saying was, don't be a boor. It doesn't play as well, but you know, I try not to be a boor wherever I go. And, you know, so that reminds me of a speech class in high school where my speech teacher, who was probably one of the best teachers I've ever had, and it's because his name was Craig. Well, no, his name was Craig, but that's not really why. But he was having an argument, really, with one of the students in the class who was a Jehovah's Witness. And he made the point that, in his mind, Jehovah's Witnesses were the biggest bores on the face of the planet, which, of course, didn't sit very well with her. But
the worst thing to say.
It is the worst thing to say. Maybe he was going for irony. I don't know. But I think the question with Paul, and what he's trying to say is that he met many different people with many different beliefs. And I don't want to be too reductionistic about this, but when that happens, we sort of have two choices. One is that we can insist that our way to see the world is the right way to see the world, and that believe that we have a duty to inform these poor ignorant people of how wrong they are and how right we are, and set about to setting them straight. It usually doesn't go over very well. And what's more, I think it's really counterproductive. And I think what Paul was really, really good at is allowing you to be you, and for him, allowing me to be me. That he had the gift of going to these places, and if somebody said, this is what I think is the right thing to do, and it didn't really, and the right thing to do wasn't, you know, setting people's hair on fire, robbing banks or something like that, then he would allow them to have that belief and go along with it. And what it let him do was build relationship. And so if somebody said, in his case, we're going to have some nice pork chops tonight. And Paul, still on that precipice of trying to understand what it was to be a Jewish Christian, certainly had a part of himself that said, I can't do this. He would do it. That if somebody said, we don't drink coffee here, he wouldn't have hit the Starbucks on the way in. One thing I did, and I didn't know any better when I was younger, and I was doing field service in hospitals and clinics, is that there was a Seventh-day Adventist hospital that was an account of mine. And I didn't know that they didn't drink caffeine. So I thought it was kind of odd that there wasn't a coffee machine in the hospital. So I hit the 7-Eleven on the way into the hospital and, you know, pick up this nice sausage biscuit while I was going to, which I now recognize was not exactly being all things to all people. But I think there's a sensitivity that comes at one point, hopefully, through aging, but even before that, through spiritual practice, that says, in the words of a former senior warden of mine when I was an Episcopalian, we need to pick the ditches that we're going to die or more contemporarily maybe, we need to choose our battles. And I think Paul started to see that what was more important was the integrity of the people he met, respecting them and building relationships, than nitpicking around individual points of belief. If you're trying to get to a point, if you feel you really have something somebody needs to hear, you're never going to get to tell it to them unless you first build relationship. And that's where I think even in terms of foreign policy, we get in trouble sometimes. The great political faux pas, the great diplomatic faux pas, are very often a case of not understanding the culture of the people that we're trying to build relationship with. And you may have what is, in all objective truth, the neatest thing in the world to offer somebody. But if you lead by offending them, they're never going to be able to hear what it is. And of course, there's a big segment of the Christian population that still doesn't seem to understand that message. There's a great segment of the Christian population that seems to believe that what's important is that I continue to present my belief and try and beat you into submission with it, because if I just do it long enough, certainly you'll see the wisdom of it. And if it doesn't work that way in the rest of the world, what in the world makes anybody think it's going to work in spirituality, which tend to be deeper held beliefs, which tend to be the way we make sense of the world. And so we had an interesting thing happen within the larger organization of which Compassionate Heart is a part in that runs. It's that one of our clergy, who was still attending and a member of a United Methodist Church, and assumed that when she became ordained with us, they transferred her to associate membership instead of full membership, found out that they had removed her from the membership rolls because, well, she was ordained in another tradition. Which brought forth the story of another one of our clergy whose father was a Southern Baptist minister for 30 years, retired, moved away, was attending a United Methodist church, joined there because he wanted to be involved there, and the Southern Baptist Convention stripped him of his ordination because he was attending another church. And what strikes me is we live in a religiously pluralistic world. It's just a fact. Religions are no longer culturally isolated or geographically isolated to different parts of the world. People are exposed to different ideas and traditions. That's the reality of the world. It's kind of the reality of the Compassionate Heart experience. And there's parts of the church that haven't even got the whole ecumenical thing down pat yet. You know, they still haven't gotten to the place where we can have little different ways that we worship. We can have little different beliefs here and there, and we can still get along because we don't have to insist that our way is the only way. It's ironic that, you know, somewhere around, say, 1900 years ago to 2,000 years ago, Paul wrote about just that, and it still hasn't penetrated the rather thick bony structure that surrounds all of our brains. Are people more important than rules? I believe they are. All the time. I believe that when you start making rules more important than people, you start walking down a path where pretty soon you're going to be sitting all alone in a corner, no matter what you do, saying, gee, where did everybody go? And so, if we hold rules loosely, but embrace people warmly, I don't believe there's any way we can go wrong.